Guys, I know none of you want to hear this, but Cormac was kind of a hippie. He had a lot of beat energy and was very interested in the movement. So much so that he traveled to hang out with some of the greatest beat writers of all time. And today we are going to be talking about Cormac's interest in the left handed path, the path of the occult, of darkness. And I've come across some new research, things I've never seen before, locked away in random articles that have put so much together in my mind. And this presentation is going to be building off what we did yesterday with talking about Cormac's religious evolution. So go watch that, and this will make a lot more sense. So, during the 1950s, when Cormac came into reading consciousness, really started getting into reading when he was in the Air Force, working as a late night DJ. This is Cormac McCarthy Jr. playing tonight Unchained Melody by Elvis Presley. Anyway, he was in the military and had a lot of time to read and to write. And the kings at that time were the Beats, especially for young people. And McCarthy came from a very religious and stringent background. And as we saw in Suttree, even the most hardcore guys like the Harrogans and all those guys, the most they ever did was really drink and kind of act a fool, like psychedelics, weed. Like these weren't a very big thing yet, and they really weren't going to really hit Tennessee and that whole area until the peak of the psychedelic era. Like Albert Hoffman wasn't and Tim Leary weren't taking vacations down in Knoxville. So when Cormac left the Air Force, at that time in his life, he probably hadn't been around too many crazy people. Like he had been around drinkers and the old Tennessee types, and there's a lot of similar people in the Air Force, and obviously, drugs in the Air Force are bad. I actually know someone who was stationed in Alaska, got caught with psychedelics, and was sentenced by military court to like a year in military jail for a charge that he would have gone probation for if he was just a citizen. Anyway, so you don't want to be doing that up in Alaska. That's not the place. And so when McCarthy, and I just learned this blew my, this put so much together. When McCarthy in 1957 left the Air Force, he didn't come back to Tennessee. He didn't get on a flight and come back to Tennessee. Where do you think he went? He went to San Francisco to go see his favorite beat writers. And this is wild because he supposedly, according to Don Williams, who's a journalist who I would trust. I've read some of his work before. And he sourced this out and heard this from family members. He went down to San Francisco and spent over a month there. And at this time, authors were still accessible. This wasn't like, you can't go find Cormac McCarthy or, these big authors living in mansions behind closed doors. Jack Kerouac, Gary Snyder, Allen Ginsberg, the whole crew, they were giving readings at City Lights bookstore. They were walking around and writing, holding events. Like they were accessible. And you could see them and be around them and maybe even talk to them. And then there was the whole crew below them: Jack Spison, William Burroughs, Richard Brodigan, or whatever his name is, Michael McClure. Michael McClure, one time at a reading, I went to one of his readings and I wanted to take a photo. And he went, I don't take photos. Why are you trying to take a photo with me? I don't pose with anyone. And then I said to him, I've seen multiple photos on you on Google of you posing with celebrities, so I'm just not good enough. Just tell me I'm not good enough. And I started arguing with him, and he was a total jerk. Anytime someone says that to me, it's the worst. I'm always so mad when someone says that to me, because I'm like, if you take photos with random celebrities or people, but you won't with me, this is a joke. Why would you show up at a public event and have people buy your book and come sign them if you're not willing to take a photo in the modern era? It's not like a Cormac McCarthy that keeps to himself and doesn't do that type of thing and wants no attention, a Don DeLillo or whoever. Like, I would get that. Anyway, don't get me started. So that was my one experience with the Beat Generation. So there was an underclass of writers there who were even more accessible, that you could just see randomly and no one would probably even know who they were, but a guy like McCarthy would. And so spending that time there, what was very formative for him, because somewhere in this 3 or 4 year period is when McCarthy also took psychedelics for the first time. And we know this is also confirmed. We don't know if it was here or in Tennessee, but I am assuming that it probably happened here for the first time, because once again, having been so constrained, McCarthy probably felt like he wanted to beat Nick out, that he had some money saved up from the military, nothing to really do up in Alaska. So he came down, and that's probably one of the big experiences that you can have. However, I am probably wrong about that, because acid really didn't hit San Francisco like that until the mid 60s, which is another interesting note that McCarthy, now I'm putting this together, most likely took LSD between meeting his first wife and his second wife in that whole exploratory period. Because it wasn't until the late 1965 that he met her, but he had been single for 4 years before that. Don't get me going on McCarthy history. So he travels there, meets the beatniks, but he didn't stay. And that was probably because he realized, like I did, that these guys are fallible. Guys like Jack Kerouac were apparently just like big jerks who were drinking all the time. Like they were all on drugs. Like none of them were very pleasant to be around. Maybe a guy like Gary Snyder, I'm sure, was much more cool, but he was also, from what I've read, to be too cool for school. Like I'm this Zen guy that knows all this and a good writer. Like these, there's a certain attitude that comes with fame that McCarthy has always not liked. And this was really this was his only attempt to be with the writers. And something must have happened to make him say, all right, I'm going back to Tennessee, because with the GI Bill and stuff, he probably could have shacked up and tried to go to school around there and like figured it out. But he didn't want to do that, and he moves back to Tennessee. And so back in Tennessee, he has his first wife, and then, some, like I said, probably some experimenting with drugs. And he has a second wife, and those relationships were pretty locked down from what I've seen. Like he had time to write, but then it was like a typical relationship and the reason he left those wives because they were supposedly naggers. They would say, well, why are you writing so much? If you're going to be writing, why don't you write something that's actually going to sell? You're selling books that make us $5,000. Like, why don't you do something real with your time? And I'm sure he didn't like that. So once he leaves his second wife, he moves to Tucson in 1974. And at this time, McCarthy is 31, 32 years old. And you could say that it was not a midlife crisis, but a midlife awakening. And this, you go, not to connect this to get too hippie, it could be McCarthy's end of his Saturn return. And McCarthy is finally freed from all of his constraints. And during this couple of year period, he has a creative revolution where he finishes The Gardener's Son and Suttree. And this is because he finally was able to get away. But what was he doing when he came to Tucson and El Paso? He wasn't just hanging out at the bar and like writing every day. No, he was traveling around. He was going down to Mexico. He was starting to do research for Blood Meridian and sleeping in bad motels and like from all the accounts that we've heard, like spending time in small villages in Mexico. And what does that sound like? That sounds like the beatniks. And that's what happens when you leave a marriage. You revert to usually two things: what you knew before or what the kids are doing then. And I don't think McCarthy in the mid 1970s was really wanting to be into disco or whatever the hell was going on. He wasn't. I'm sure that was all very foreign to him. So he reverted to something that he knew well, which was the beatnik mindset. And this is apparent because all the authors at this time, literally at this exact time, from the beatniks, the Beats, they all start showing up in the archive while he's working on Suttree and The Gardener's Son. It's also interesting to know at this time that I think he was trying to go through one of these revolutions in his life because he had been poor. He had been looked down upon. He'd been, told you're not good enough. And so he was going to show everyone he was good enough by doing what? By creating a hit TV show. And The Gardener's Son did relatively well, but McCarthy at this time almost thought that he was going to be purely a screenwriter. He was thinking about giving up writing in general. We may not have gotten Suttree and Blood Meridian because of all this. I mean, it's wild to think about. And so I think all that kind of confirms that McCarthy is in kind of this rebellious attitude. So let's kind of talk about the authors and who he was thinking about. The first one being kind of the king of the whole hippie generation and MK Ultra and was planning and scheming in the 1950s. And that is Aldous Huxley. And Huxley is known for, obviously, by the fiction community for his book, Brave New World, which, I'm not the biggest fan of. But Huxley actually has published a lot of novels, and some of them are pretty good. I think I've read 5. There's one called After Many a Summer Dies the Swan, and I generally liked the novel. It was pretty good, especially for the time it was being written. And quick story about that. I remember I tried to date this girl, and it's so weird. I guess this isn't weird, but when you meet someone and they fixate on an author and they've never read anyone else. I remember meeting this girl, and she was fixated on Aldous Huxley and his novels and was reading them all very slowly, but hadn't really read anyone else. And like the lit bro I am, I started reading all the novels too so that I could maybe be able to, impress her. But it ended up not working out because I was just too out there for her. Anyway, McCarthy, from what we know, was not just reading Huxley, like the main works, but some very underground works, travel notebooks, journals, and other things, which is interesting because Huxley really isn't the king of the beats. I mean, he was a little, I mean, too old for all that. Really wasn't that involved, and he was more involved in kind of the philosophical side, including eugenics of the whole hippie philosophy. One could argue, and I would, is that he was the mastermind of the whole hippie movement in general, and maybe involved with MK Ultra itself, but that's a whole other rabbit hole that we don't need to get into. So McCarthy was interested in Huxley, which was a very philosophical branch, but what he was doing at this time was building up Sutry's beat and psychedelic experience, because it's been said that Sutry is semi-autobiographical. And what Sutry is doing is doing the rambling, going through these psychedelic experiences, but really not giving the revelation he needs until he leaves, which mirrors McCarthy. That McCarthy was trying to experience these doors of perception, but no matter how deep he went, he always got sucked back in until he went all the way. At the end of the novel, he goes all the way and has a near-death experience and a very deep psychedelic experience, and that finally pushes him over the edge. And a lot of this actually came in the later drafts of Sutry. Like, that wasn't always present. So I think in his research and in his time after he left El Paso and through while he was researching these things, I think he connected that, like, this is evolution. I think it was a reference to himself. We also know that McCarthy read George Gurdjieff, whatever we want to call him, who is one of the more famous occultists of the 20th century. And then last but not least, McCarthy actually imitated and was influenced by Allen Ginsberg, who at the time when McCarthy went to San Francisco had released Howl already and was speaking. And McCarthy actually imitates certain aspects of Howl in Sutry. So the first reference to Ginsberg is a writing that Ginsberg makes on the imprisonment of Timothy Leary, which I think McCarthy was viewing in retrospect as a very terrible thing, which I guess aids to his either liberal or libertarian mindset around drugs, which would make sense with his political philosophy that we've talked about before. Next, he actually imitates parts of Howl in Sutry. In Howl, Ginsberg says that they are burning their money in wastebaskets, listening to the tear through the walls. Then in Sutry, McCarthy says, Sutry felt a tear coming through the walls. He was seized with a thing he'd never known, a sudden understanding of the mathematical certainty of death. And this next reference is a little bit more shaky, but Ginsberg says in Howl, they butchered out of their own bodies good to eat 1,000 years. And McCarthy says, quote, in Sutry, he knew another McNally, good to last 1,000 years, which, that one is a little bit more shaky, but we do know that he was referencing Ginsberg at the time. So I could see how and was reading him. So I could see how those connections could come together once you really look at the meta of what McCarthy does, because he shakes things up and imitates stuff all the time. And I can't wait for the future, because there's so much stuff that hasn't been found yet, like in his works, because it seems like not most of them, but a lot of his work in there is just like him imitating and rephrasing or restyling a lot of things. And sometimes, as we just saw, he literally almost copies word for word the expression, which is smart. Why not do it? Like, tear coming through the wall. How else are you going to say that? You could get a thesaurus out and change something, change wall to room or tear to something else. But Ginsberg, you already know it works. Ginsberg used something and it worked. So why not use it yourself and know it's going to work? No one, except some like crazy scholars and us meta people out here, are ever going to know the difference, or that he took it from anywhere. So that's just something that I always try to remember, that when I write something original and I look at it, I'm like, man, how could I make this better? Or am I that good? It's like, I haven't had editors on this yet. I haven't imitated or taken anything from anyone. And so it can be vastly improved if I do that. All right. So this is my analysis of MK Ultra, but in the next video, we're going to be examining and taking this to the next level by talking about McCarthy's love of the postmodernist Michel Foucault, which kind of is going to cement all the religious video and this one together by showing us that the irrational instead of the rational is the best place to source wisdom from. And that's what McCarthy believed. And I'll see you guys in the next video when it releases.